Hello, in this video I will be discussing how MLK Jr. and Naim Ateek apply the insights of the Exodus story to their own situation. I will also share how their interpretations of God and Israelite history overlap and differ, as well as how they agree and differ on the interpretations of God's promises and interactions with Israelites. MLK uses the Exodus story to explore how evil is with us. He states, "The Bible is crystal clear in its perception of evil. The theme that MLK pulls from Exodus is the long struggle between good and evil, and how good always emerges as the victor." MLK states in his sermon, "A mythical Satan, through the work of a conniving serpent, may gain the allegiance of man for a period. But ultimately he must give way to the magnetic redemptive power of a humble servant on an uplifted cross." By this he means, in the real world and in most religious writings, although we see a period of evil or darkness, goodness will always prevail in the end. Ateek analyzes the story of Exodus through the ownership of the land of Palestine. Ateek states, "One cannot deny that there is a great difference between the outlook of the Old Testament and that of the New Testament on the issue of land." He compares the different testaments to show how each explained that God was no more the owner of the land of Palestine, but the owner of the whole world. Ateek goes on to explain how Jews have come to understand their identity and how Palestinian Christians pride themselves on the fact that they lived where Jesus was born, died, and resurrected. But at the same time, that is not the reason they defend their right to the land. And many of the Israeli Jews know that in order to live their religious faith, they don't have to have exclusive political control of all of Palestine. We can see MLK Jr.'s and Naim Ateek's interpretation of God and Israelite history overlap in these two quotes. Ateek states, "If the people are going to be a light of the nations, then they have to be the carriers of that blessing, rather than hoarding it." Ateek shares this and then explores how it leads to a deeper concept of a movement from a narrow concept of God and the land to a broader, deeper, and more inclusive concept. MLK's view of Exodus ties into his advocacy for inclusivity. MLK states, "The Red Sea has opened, and today most of these exploited masses have won their freedom from Egypt and colonialism, and now are free to move toward the promised land of economic security and cultural development. As they look back, they clearly see the evils of colonialism and imperialism dead upon the seashore." In this quote, he shares how the Israelites won their freedom and can now move towards a better life, and as Ateek said, are carriers of that blessing. Ateek's and MLK's views don't really conflict with each other because they are both analyzing the story of Exodus for different reasons. Ateek states, "We must encourage the more open understanding of God and the land as it is found in the Bible, rather than the more narrow and limited view." MLK states, "It symbolizes something much deeper than the drowning of a few men, for no one can rejoice at the death or the defeat of a human person. This story, at bottom, symbolizes the death of evil. It was the death of inhumane oppression and ungodly exploitation." Ateek is more focused on how different religions view the story and how it affects them, and MLK is more focused on proving the point that goodness always beats evil in the end. Both Ateek and MLK Jr. believe in God's promises and the importance of his words. Ateek states, "I believe that the lesson God has tried to teach the ancient Hebrews all along is the importance of understanding God's promises." He then goes on to say, "The Bible witnesses to the misunderstood promises of God. Chosenness, when intended to be a responsibility for service, was understood as a privilege to hoard." MLK states, "He is seeking at every moment of his existence to lift men from the bondage of some evil Egypt, carrying them through the wilderness of discipline, and finally to the promised land of personal and social Integration. Ateek analyzes how it is important to understand God's promises, and the Israelites found this out through exile. Once they left the land, they found out that God exists outside that land as well as his promises. MLK shares this quote in his sermon to prove that God is a man of his promises and will always defeat evil. A difference in interpretation of God's promises I observed from reading both Naim Ateek's interpretation and MLK Jr.'s interpretation is that Ateek directly talks about God's promises, and MLK doesn't use the word promise, but implies that God's actions prove he will always overcome evil. MLK states, "Let us not despair. Let us not lose faith in man, and certainly not in God. We must believe that prejudiced mind can be changed, and that man, by the grace of God, can be lifted from the valley of hate to the high mountain of love." Ateek uses a document written by some Anglican fundamentalist, and Ateek states, later in the document, this person concludes that God swore an oath that the land is an eternal possession of Israel, though they did not deserve it. Would it not be strange if God decided against fulfilling his strong and numerous promises to Israel about the land? If God breaks such promises, how reliable is he in other promises? I believe Ateek shares this to show that it's almost silly to question God's promises. And lastly, MLK states, God has a great plan for this world. Through MLK Jr.'s words, I can tell he has faith in the actions God makes.